They told me I was lucky to be alive, that surviving a catastrophic systems failure at that depth was a miracle. The word they used most was anomaly, mechanical anomaly, navigational anomaly, a tragic anomaly that took 31 lives and spared one. Me. No mention of the route we took, no acknowledgement of what we encountered, no explanation for how I surfaced alone, dehydrated, muttering in dead languages they said I must have heard in a dream. The official report lists me as a sonar technician, recently transferred to a deep ocean research division. But there is no division by that name. No official records of the mission. Just the empty shell of the USS Thresher 2, registered lost due to implosion. I've read the report 100 times. It's as much fiction as the stories I now carry in my head. The truth, if it even qualifies as such, is buried beneath miles of water and a silence more complete than vacuum. And yet, it hums. Quietly, persistently, in my bones. I hear it every night, even now, as I sit in this worn cabin far from the ocean. The radio turned to static because silence is worse. I keep the lights dim, the curtains shut. I sleep in bursts. I dream in fragments. But I remember everything. And I need someone to know. Someone has to know. Before all this, I was a man of method. 14 years in the Navy, 2 overseas deployments, reassigned to sonar tech after a head injury during a collision drill. I liked the precision of sonar, the clean, impersonal rhythm of echoes and reflections, distance and density. It made sense. It followed rules. But that comfort began to erode the day a man in a suit I didn't recognize handed me a black folder with no title and said, "You've been reassigned." I asked what the mission was. He said, "Oceanic reconnaissance." I asked how long I'd be gone. He said, "Classified." I asked what vessel I'd be boarding. He didn't answer, just smiled and walked away, leaving me with a folder that had no pages inside, just a single strip of magnetic tape and a list of coordinates that didn't match any known naval path. They picked me up at night. No port, no uniforms. Just a black SUV with windows too dark to see through and a driver who didn't speak. I was taken to an airfield I didn't recognize, flown out to a platform in the middle of nowhere, and escorted down a staircase that led to a pressure-sealed elevator shaft. It descended for 9 minutes. When the doors opened, I saw her, the Thresher 2. She wasn't like any vessel I'd served on before. Sleek, obsidian black hull. No hull number, no flag, no noise. Just her, floating in the moonlit dock like a shadow pretending to be real. They gave me no time to inspect her. I was escorted aboard, handed a checklist, and told to report to Sonar Room 3. No names, no ranks. The crew didn't make eye contact. Some looked too young, others too old. And one man had eyes that didn't blink, even when the cabin lights flickered overhead. I tried to ask where we were headed. The reply came from the captain himself, a tall man with pale skin and a voice like rusted steel. "We follow the signal," he said. That was it. That was the only explanation I was given. And somehow I understood. Not consciously, not logically, but I understood. We submerged 3 hours later. I watched the surface disappear through the observation scope. The descent was smooth, eerily so. No groaning metal, no pressure fluctuation. Just a slow, continuous drop into blackness. The sonar began its sweep. Normal pings at first. Reflections from the continental shelf. A school of squid. A sunken trawler. All within expectations. But then, a flat zone. No echo. No texture. A void. I recalibrated. No change. I logged it. No response. The captain stared at the screen for a long time before muttering, "We're close." Close to what? I didn't ask. Something told me not to. I sat back in my chair, listening to the rhythm of the sonar, and tried to find comfort in the routine. But the comfort was gone, replaced by the hum. It wasn't electronic. It wasn't from the engines. It came from below, or maybe from within. A slow, rising frequency that settled behind my teeth like a second heartbeat. That's when the dreams began. The first night, in my bunk. I saw a staircase carved in coral, spiraling down through an impossible ocean trench. At the bottom, a door with no handle, no seams. Just a glyph etched into the surface. A spiral inside a circle, wrapped in 7 angular lines. When I touched it, I felt something recognize me. I woke gasping, bleeding from the gums. The medic said I'd bitten my cheek in my sleep, but he didn't make eye contact when he said it, and I noticed the faint red mark on his wrist. Same symbol. Smaller. Faded. Almost like a scar. After that, the crew began to change. Faces I hadn't seen before were suddenly working shifts beside me. Rooms I remembered as storage now had equipment I didn't understand. The cafeteria was silent. No one ate. The food trays remained full. The coffee machine dispensed nothing. I tried to joke with one of the engineers about it. He stared at me for a full minute, unblinking, before walking away. I went back to Sonar Room 3 and reviewed the last 36 hours of logs. Most were corrupted. The few that remained showed signal spikes that hadn't been flagged. Triangular pulses, spaced in threes, repeating like breath. I overlaid the waveform with known geological and biological sources. No match. I compared it to recorded underwater volcanic events, tectonic shearing, even marine mammal communication. Nothing. Except one fragment. A half-second segment that, when slowed down and converted into audio range, sounded like a voice. Not in English. Not in anything I knew. But the cadence, it was language. Intentional. And it spoke in my voice. I reported it to the bridge. The captain looked at me and said, "It knows you now," then turned away. That was the last time he spoke to me directly. I began writing everything down after that. On paper. In notebooks I kept hidden in a maintenance hatch behind the sonar desk. I didn't trust the ship's logs anymore. Didn't trust the digital systems. Too much was disappearing. Being rewritten. One moment I'd record a sequence of pings. The next, the file would be blank, or replaced with hours of silence. But the silence wasn't empty. I started playing it on loop. Listening. And in that stillness, I heard patterns. Structures. Words, maybe. Ideas. Not human. But not alien either. Other. I listened until my ears rang and my nose bled. And I kept listening. I don't know how many days passed before the breach. The moment it all changed. But I remember the feeling. Like being watched by something older than sight. Something beneath knowledge. Not evil. Not even malicious. Just aware. Vastly aware. And hungry. Not for flesh, but for self. And in that moment, deep in that steel coffin drifting further from reality, I understood the simplest and most terrifying truth of all. We weren't meant to come back. But somehow, I did. And whatever followed me, never left. They said it was reconnaissance, but no one reconned anything without maps, without protocols, without even a damn objective. It wasn't just that there was no briefing. I'd been on enough Black Ops support deployments to know some missions don't come with outlines. But this was a void. A vacuum pretending to be structure. We were launched into the sea with a purpose that refused to declare itself. And somehow everyone else on board seemed content with that. Or rather, conditioned to it. There was a lifelessness to the way they moved, like chess pieces already assigned their endgame. I should have turned back when I boarded. Should have asked why I was the only one given a temporary clearance badge without a name. Why the vessel had no commissioning plaque, no hull ID, not even an American flag. You can fake a lot of things at sea, but not identity. And this ship had none. It didn't belong to any country. And it sure as hell didn't belong to the Navy. Not the Navy I swore an oath to. I spent the first 48 hours pacing. The sonar room was cold and dim, always bathed in that artificial blue-green glow that made your skin feel like it belonged to a different species. The equipment wasn't standard, not even experimental Navy grade. It was something else. I tried to familiarize myself with the interface, but every time I thought I had figured out the waveform display or the amplitude filters, the system would shift, like it was adapting to something I couldn't perceive. There were modules that didn't appear in the manual. Ports labeled with glyphs instead of text. A constant background hum that I originally attributed to the engines, until I realized it didn't fade when the turbines idled. That hum was something different. Not auditory. Not measurable, but perceptible in a way that scratched the inside of your skull. The logs were sanitized. Scrubbed. I checked the system activity reports and found nothing before my arrival. The sonar data started at the moment I powered up my station. That's impossible. Even a system reboot leaves a trace. But these logs didn't just erase data. They filled the void with fake patterns, artificial sweeps, standard ocean floor profiles. I ran an algorithmic comparison and discovered that the profile looped every 3 hours. The same ocean floor data repeated, pixel for pixel. Fabricated reality. Digital stagecraft. I brought this to the senior technician, a man named Weller who never blinked and smelled faintly of ozone. He looked at my report, nodded once, and said, "Don't worry about it. Just listen for the signal." I asked what signal. He smiled. Not a human smile, not one that reached the eyes, and said, "You'll know." By day 3 I stopped sleeping. Not just from paranoia, but because every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear it. Not the hum. Something deeper. A low, slow frequency that pulsed just beneath the floor of consciousness. It wasn't sound. It was shape. That's the best I can describe it. Like something reaching through layers of my mind and wrapping itself around the parts that still remembered sunlight and safety. I stopped eating. The mess hall had food, but it tasted like metal and memory. I watched the others chew in silence, their jaws moving in rhythm, in unison, like a hive. No one spoke unless ordered. No one laughed. There was no music, no television, just a silence so total that even whispers felt blasphemous. On the 4th day, I decided to break protocol. I went to the command deck during second rotation, when the bridge crew was at minimum. I wanted answers, or at least a glimpse of the navigational data. But when I arrived, I found the main terminal blank. No map. No charts, just a black screen with a single line of text. Unknown space, course locked. That's it. I tried to access the coordinates manually, but the interface rejected my clearance level. I bypassed it, an old trick from my tech school days. What I found made no sense. We weren't anywhere near the Atlantic Ridge, as I'd been told. We weren't even in a recognized trench system. The submarine had taken us into a vertical descent, directly into a section of the ocean floor that had never been mapped. Not because it was remote, but because it wasn't supposed to exist. A chasm beneath a seafloor shelf that no satellite imagery had ever captured. A void within a void. I confronted the captain. I shouldn't have, but I needed to know. I waited until he was alone, reviewing something in his private cabin. A file I wasn't meant to see. Some kind of audio spectrogram with frequencies well beyond human range. I asked him what our mission really was. His face didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at me like he was measuring the exact amount of oxygen it would take to let me die slowly. Then he said, "There are zones on this planet not meant to be breached." This one woke up. We were tasked with listening. I asked what we were supposed to do if we found something. He responded without hesitation. "Observe. And contain, if possible." I asked what contain meant at this depth. His lips curved. "Barely. It means we don't surface." That night, a new message appeared on the sonar interface, a string of symbols, pulsing in a tight triangle formation. Not marine life, not seismic. Something intentional. I saved a copy. Tried to decode it. No cipher I knew worked. But then it started showing up elsewhere, reflected in the shape of my coffee mug on the table, etched into the condensation on the viewing port, carved into the palm of my own hand, though I had no memory of doing it. That triangle followed me. I started seeing it in my dreams again, spiraling, pulsing, drawing me downward. On the 7th day, the ship began to vibrate. Not from turbulence, not from pressure, but from something beneath us. Something large, something awake. I asked Weller what it was. He said, "We've crossed into pattern 0. You'll understand soon." I asked what pattern 0 meant. He just tapped his temple and said, "Resonance." Then he walked into the reactor corridor and never came back. No one looked for him. His name vanished from the manifest. It was as if he'd never been there at all. I tried to radio out. Tried to use emergency frequencies. No response. But the system didn't say, "Signal lost." It said, "Signal unreturned." As if something heard me, but refused to answer. I finally understood that we hadn't been sent to discover anything. We were bait. Or a mirror, held up to something so far beyond comprehension that even seeing our reflection had consequences. The mission wasn't reconnaissance. It was invocation. And we had already been heard. The first time I noticed one of them wasn't real. He was brushing his teeth. He stood at the sink in the crew lavatory, back hunched, the dim yellow light overhead flickering with a stutter that matched the rhythm of the pipes. He held the brush to his mouth but didn't move it. Just stared into the mirror. unmoving, as though waiting for something in the reflection to respond first. I didn't say anything, just watched. But he didn't blink, not once. And then, subtly, his reflection didn't match. Not the angle, not the timing. The man standing there paused, lowered his head slightly, and walked out without a glance. The reflection stayed half a second longer, eyes fixed on me, before fading with the next flicker of light. I stood alone, unsure if I'd actually seen what I thought I had, or if the exhaustion was finally fracturing me. But that wasn't the last time I saw it happen. The thing about deep-sea deployments is that they're already psychologically corrosive. Isolation warps perspective. Circadian rhythms break down. You forget the difference between dream and memory. You talk to yourself just to hear a human voice. But this wasn't that. This wasn't deterioration. This was intrusion. It started with small things. One of the navigation officers, Lowry, I think his name was, stopped answering to it. I called out to him during equipment diagnostics, and he just stared ahead, as if that name didn't belong to him anymore. Later that shift, I checked the personnel registry. There was no one named Lowry. The slot was listed as active, name redacted. I tried asking the other techs. They looked at me like I'd interrupted a prayer. One simply muttered, "No one here by that name," and walked away. The personnel shift wasn't just names. It was faces. Faces that changed subtly each day. A different mole. A missing scar. Eyes that used to be green turning brown. Not all at once. Never blatant. Just enough for you to question your own recall. But I remember faces better than most. I always had. It's part of what made me good with sonar. Patterns, symmetry, deviation. And these deviations were intentional. Constructed. As though someone, or something, was adjusting the variables of the crew, day by day, to see how long it would take before I noticed. At one point, I tried photographing them. Old Polaroids from the emergency locker. But the photos developed as nothing but blur. Not motion blur. Not overexposure. Just void. As if the camera saw something it didn't know how to process. One night, I wandered into the mess hall at 0400, unable to sleep. I found a woman there. Blonde, tall, very still. I'd never seen her before. I asked her name. She looked at me and said, "Do you remember the words?" I asked what words. She repeated, "Do you remember the words?" I backed out, returned to my bunk, and found the phrase etched into the metal wall above my pillow in perfect block letters. That same phrase. And below it, scratched with something far sharper than a nail. "You won't." From then on, I kept my head down. I stopped asking names, stopped checking logs, just did my sonar shifts and documented anomalies. And they increased. Not the crew changes, though those never stopped, but the sonar echoes. Patterns started coming through that weren't echoes at all. They were responses. Pings that carried latency. Deliberate delay. Like a voice pausing before speaking. And within those pulses, harmonics. Audio frequencies that, when isolated and slowed, formed tonal intervals not found in any natural acoustic system. They weren't random. They were musical. Composed. I overlaid them with the old magnetic tape I'd received before deployment. The match was perfect, which meant whoever, or whatever, was behind the signal had already been listening, long before we ever launched. The captain stopped appearing on the bridge. Command passed unofficially to a senior engineer named Marks. But no one questioned it. The hierarchy dissolved overnight, yet everyone seemed to operate as if nothing had changed. Orders came through the comms, faceless, toneless. Rooms were reassigned without announcement. One day I went to engineering for diagnostics and found the space entirely gutted. Cables had been pulled out of the walls. No tools. No personnel. Just humming wires hanging like vines, and the faint sound of breathing, not mine, somewhere in the dark. Weller, who had vanished days earlier, appeared again without warning. He walked into the sonar room, sat down beside me and said, "They've started mimicking emotion now. That means they're testing thresholds." I asked who they were. He didn't answer. Just handed me a small metal cube and told me to keep it close when it starts. "When what starts?" I asked. But he was already walking out. I never saw him again. The cube hummed faintly when held. It grew cold when I thought of home. Warm when I remembered the dreams. I stopped trying to interpret it. Then there were the disappearances. Not like Weller. His absence had at least caused momentary confusion. These were different. Entire shifts gone. Whole crews who had stood beside me hours earlier, now erased from manifests, from lockers, from memory itself. Only I seemed to remember them. I tried to confront one of the night officers. He didn't deny it. He simply said, "Memory is a liability at this depth. They told you that, didn't they?" When I said no, he smiled in that same strange way I'd seen the others use. Like an imitation. A mouth copying the shape of a smile without understanding why. "Then you've already lasted longer than most," he said. That night, I was summoned to a deck I hadn't seen before. Sub-level 9. No access logs. No map. Just a hallway I didn't remember walking through before, with smooth metal walls and a faint violet light that seemed to come from the rivets themselves. At the end was a sealed chamber. Inside, I saw what they'd been doing. Rows of chairs. Like a theater. Each one held a crew member. Some I recognized. Some I didn't. All unconscious. Their heads tilted slightly forward. Faces covered in a film of translucent gel that pulsed faintly. Machines monitored neural activity. None showed signs of REM. None showed signs of waking. I stepped closer to one. It was the woman from the mess hall. Her eyes snapped open as I approached. She whispered, "You were never meant to see this." And then the lights went out. I woke in my bunk 6 hours later. The room was cold. The phrase above my pillow was gone. But the cube was glowing softly. And in my gut, I knew this wasn't a mission anymore. It was a harvesting. And I was next. They told us we'd descend to just under 23,000 feet. That was the last figure anyone officially mentioned. After that, the numbers vanished. The digital readouts that tracked our descent flickered, froze, then reset with a blank screen. We were told it was a data relay issue, but no one attempted to fix it. And more importantly, no one reacted like it mattered. That's when I understood. We weren't just diving deep. We were going somewhere we weren't supposed to name. Somewhere already scrubbed from the record. It began slowly, the way most pressure sickness does. But this was different. The kind of disorientation we experienced couldn't be measured in PSI or decompression schedules. My vision didn't blur. It sharpened. Hyper-aware. As if the farther we descended, the more alert I became. Not in the way adrenaline hones the senses, but as though something else was waking up inside me. My fingertips tingled constantly. Not with pain, but with recognition. I knew we'd passed 26,000 feet, then 30,000. I felt it in my bones. This wasn't just a dive. It was a descent into a zone where biology no longer had dominion. That's when the sonar went silent. I don't mean it malfunctioned. I mean it chose silence. There was no echo, no terrain bounce, no aquatic life. Just a vast absence, like the ocean itself had been carved hollow. It didn't matter how many frequencies I tried. Nothing came back. And yet, beneath that silence, there was something else. A low, rhythmic tone. It didn't show on any system, but I could hear it. Not with my ears, but somewhere deeper. The kind of sound that makes the fluid in your joints buzz, like a vibration in your marrow. I turned to Jenkins, our secondary sonar officer. Asked if he heard it. He blinked slowly and said, "There's nothing down here." Then he smiled, like someone who's just accepted death. The rest of the crew didn't notice. Or they pretended not to. Meals were eaten in silence. Shifts rotated like clockwork, though no one checked the time anymore. The captain stopped issuing commands. The Thresher 2 had become a drifting coffin, spiraling downward through black pressure so thick it felt like swimming through oil. And still, the hull held. We should have imploded around 35,000 feet. Every submarine ever built had limits, and we had long passed them. But the metal didn't groan. It hummed, as if the sub itself had become part of the frequency. I started marking our descent manually. Every 15 minutes, I etched a line into my notebook. Not based on depth logs, those were dead, but based on the changes I felt. Changes in gravity, in tension, in reality. At what I guessed was 38,000 feet, the lights flickered for the first time. Only not in the way electronics fail. They didn't dim. They breathed. Pulsed, softly, like lungs. A slow inhale and exhale of pale, bluish light, rhythmic, synchronized with the vibration in my chest. I looked at the others. No reaction. One of them was even sleeping, head resting awkwardly against the console, eyes twitching under closed lids like someone in REM sleep, except he was snoring through clenched teeth. When we passed what must have been 40,000 feet, time loosened. We stopped knowing when one shift ended and another began. I once sat at the comm station for what felt like 15 minutes, only to realize my beard had grown visibly longer. Another time, I returned to my bunk and found my hands covered in dust. Ash, maybe, though there was no fire on board. The crew stopped acknowledging one another. They moved like mannequins repositioned between blinks. I began hearing whispering behind the walls. Not voices, not language, but patterns, repetitions, phrases that weren't made of words, but intent. At what I guessed to be around 42,000 feet, we felt a jolt. Not mechanical, not seismic. It was like the water itself had pushed back. For the first time since we'd submerged, the sub slowed. Instruments remained blank, but I knew. We'd reached something, not a floor, not a geological feature, but a barrier. Something thick, something unwilling. The captain stood at the helm, silent, unmoving. He placed his hand on the throttle, didn't speak, and pushed forward. The pressure outside should have crushed us like a tin can. But instead, it was like slipping through film. A membrane. The lights turned violet. Not tinted. Fully transformed. The air smelled different. Not oil, not salt, but old. The kind of scent that doesn't belong in nature. Like opening a sealed crypt and breathing the age itself. I looked out the viewing port and saw nothing. Not blackness, not shadow. Just absence. A space with no texture, no depth. Just smooth emptiness, like we'd entered a scar in reality. Then, slowly, something began to appear. Shapes. Not made of matter but of outline. The suggestion of things. A spire here. A curve there. Pieces of a place not built, but remembered. It was like the ocean was remembering something ancient, and showing it to us. Only us. I turned to say something, but the crew was frozen. Literally unmoving. Eyes open. Breath held. Like statues waiting for a cue. The Thresher 2 wasn't moving anymore. We were being carried, and still. No one reacted. Except me. Except the frequency in my head, which had grown so loud I could no longer hear my own thoughts. The Thresher 2 drifted forward with no propulsion, no noise, no acknowledgement from its crew, as if the laws of mechanics had been suspended in favor of something older and quieter. I sat at the observation bay, though calling it a bay was generous. It was a reinforced slit of treated glass meant more for diagnostics than for wonder. And yet, I was the only one using it now. My hands trembled around the sides of the viewport, but not from fear, from instinct. Something buried deep within my nervous system recognized what the sea was about to show us, long before my conscious mind did. Shapes began to resolve in the violet light that leaked through the void. Not immediate, not sudden, but slow, deliberate, like a curtain being drawn from across a stage stretched to infinity. First came the shadows. Long skeletal outlines pressed into the sediment below us, some barely distinguishable from the ridges and crests of the seafloor, others so violently preserved that even their corrosion seemed frozen in time. The Thresher descended further, and that's when I realized these weren't geological formations. They were wrecks. But not just any wrecks. Submarines. Hundreds. Some intact, their hulls twisted by pressure but still recognizable. Others split open, yawning their empty rib cages of rust into the deep. One, I swear, looked identical to the Seawolf class we'd been told was lost in the Arctic in 2006. But what was it doing here, in the mid-Atlantic? Another bore the signature double hull of an early Soviet Typhoon, yet its serial numbers were American. A bastardized design. A hybrid. Many of them were unmarked. Their insignias corroded or absent. Their architectures unnatural. Sleeker, curved, built with materials I didn't recognize. None of this made sense. If we were thousands of feet below accepted structural tolerances, how had so many vessels made it here? And if they had, why had they stayed? We passed a trench, more like a gouge, that split the blackened seafloor like a claw mark. Inside it lay something that once was a submersible, now barely a carcass. Its conning tower jutted out like a broken tooth. Its antenna array looped and twisted around itself like melted glass. and at its base, dozens of smaller objects floated motionless. At first, I mistook them for debris, but then I noticed something horrifying. They were arranged, not scattered, not random, arranged, in a spiral, perfectly spaced, equidistant, curling outward from the wreckage like petals from a dead flower. We weren't looking at an accident site. This was a display. I stood from the viewport, stumbled back into the control room, needing someone else to see it. But the crew hadn't moved. The captain remained locked in place at the helm, one hand raised mid-motion, frozen like a marionette suspended mid-act. The rest sat in silence, their eyes glassy, not blinking. Something had paused them. Or worse, emptied them. I leaned over Jenkins and shook his shoulder. Nothing. His body was warm, but his pupils had dilated to the point where the iris was no longer visible. I whispered his name. Then I screamed it. Still nothing. Behind me, the sonar blinked once, then again. A single pulse returned. Not from the trench, but from below us. I returned to the viewport just in time to see the floor begin to fall away. It was no longer seabed, it was a shelf, a bluff, and we were passing over its edge. What lay beneath could not be called a valley, or a crater. It had no name. It was a grave, vast, ordered, black, endless. Hundreds more wrecks layered beneath us in intricate geometric patterns. Not piled, not crashed, stacked. A kind of burial. A grid of metal coffins whose arrangement suggested not war, not accident, but offering. I saw a U-boat from World War II with its swastika still faintly visible. Next to it, a Chinese nuclear sub with a hull breach wide enough to crawl through. Beside that, something I still can't describe. Not a submarine. Not a ship. More like an artifact. Smooth. Oval. Studded with filaments that pulsed faintly in colors I still can't name. It was not built on Earth. Of that, I am certain. And the worst part wasn't what we saw. It was what we didn't. There were no bodies. No human remains. No skeletons. Just empty machines, drained of their purpose. Something had taken them. All of them. Extracted the flesh and left the casing. And now, we were here too. I tried to override the controls. Nothing responded. The joystick rotated freely, unanchored. The systems hummed with a resonance too perfect, as though the thresher wasn't resisting, but surrendering. We were part of the ritual now. Just another relic descending toward a place that should never have existed. The hum deepened. The lights inside the ship flickered to match the pulse. My ears began to bleed. But it wasn't pain I felt. It was familiarity. Like recognizing a lullaby your mother never sang, but your bones still remembered. I stumbled toward the rear hatch, away from the crew, away from the glass. I passed the engine room, which no longer vibrated. It didn't even smell of fuel anymore. It smelled like stone. Cold, ancient, sealed stone. And in that silence, I understood. We were no longer submerged in water. The Thresher 2 was moving through something else now. Something that didn't push or flow, but waited. Waited for more. For us. For me. And though I tried not to look again, I couldn't help it. One last glance through the glass. Just one. At the edge of the grave field, almost out of sight, there was something standing upright. Not metal, not machine. A figure. Still. Watching. Facing the sub. Tall. Too tall. With limbs that didn't match. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Because the moment I saw it, I knew. I had seen it before. In dreams I never remembered. Until now. There was a moment, perhaps no longer than a breath, when I believed that we had reached the deepest point possible, not just of the ocean, but of comprehension. That we had descended beyond pressure, beyond gravity, beyond everything that tethered the human body and mind to the known world. And then, without warning or announcement, the sea spoke back. Not in sonar pings, not in tremors or temperature shifts, but in an impulse so sudden and absolute that I thought I had died. The lights inside the Thresher 2 cut out all at once, plunging us into a black so perfect it felt like matter itself had ceased. Consoles, instruments, auxiliary systems, every circuit went still. Even the emergency lights failed to blink. For 11 seconds we floated unmoored, untouched, suspended in pure silence. But that silence was not empty. It pulsed. I didn't hear it. I felt it. Inside my teeth, behind my eyes, curling around my spinal cord like a hand that had always been there, just waiting. My lungs forgot how to breathe. My heart stuttered once, then slowed into rhythm with something external, something ancient. All around me, the crew remained frozen, eyes open, unblinking, their mouths slightly agape, as if they were listening to a voice only they could hear. Then the lights returned. Not in a flicker, not in a staggered reboot, but all at once. Everything came online simultaneously, even systems that had previously been dormant or disabled. Screens glowed, engines hummed, pressure regulators recalibrated to numbers that no longer made sense. And in the center of the room, the sonar console issued a single ping. The wave returned not from rock, or trench, or metallic wreckage. It returned from motion. Something below us had moved, but not like a creature. No current was displaced, no sediment stirred. It didn't slither or swim. It shifted, as though it had been dormant for centuries, and now, somehow, it had noticed us. The sonar pulse repeated. The screen showed a new object now, shaped unlike any biological form, without a defined outline, but marked by a consistent, repeating movement. It wasn't a life form as we understand them. It had no skeletal structure, no symmetrical mass, no heat signature. But it responded. The sonar pinged again, and for the first time in my career, the return signal was not an echo. It was an answer. It clicked. Not a mechanical click. Not like metal against metal or circuits sparking. This was language. Layered, complex, not heard, but perceived. Like multiple frequencies stacked together, folding through each other to form a kind of thought too dense for human cognition. I staggered back, clutching my head as the pressure built. The others didn't move. Their expressions hadn't changed since before the blackout. I realized then they hadn't returned. Whatever they were before the pulse, they weren't anymore. I crawled to the communication panel and tried to isolate the signal. The frequency wasn't radio, wasn't sonar, wasn't electromagnetic or gravitational. It was something other. A modulation of space itself. A curvature of reality behaving like information. It didn't travel through anything, it simply was. And it was aimed directly at us. No, not us. Me. I watched in frozen dread as the sonar console began translating the waveforms into a shape. Not words, not symbols, just form. On the screen appeared an impossible structure, like a topological knot, looping into itself in dimensions I couldn't visualize. And then it moved. The shape rotated, inverted, folded until it resembled something vaguely human. Or perhaps it was adjusting itself to appear human, like a costume worn over geometry. The voice clicked again, this time faster, and images flashed in my head. Cities submerged in black water, oceans boiling from within, creatures descending into trenches that pulsed with unnatural light. I saw temples built from bone and signal, languages etched in coral that never died, and stars collapsing in sequence like dominoes pushed by intention. I tried to stand, but my legs refused. My vision tunneled. My thoughts fractured. I knew, this was not contact with another species. It was not extraterrestrial. It was not even life as we understand it. It was older. This thing had no beginning, no birth. It was not made. It was revealed. And it lived not in the ocean, but in the idea of the ocean. It existed wherever depth existed. It was encoded into the concept of pressure, of darkness, of isolation. Not an organism, but a constant, like death, like time. The captain turned to face me then, as if on cue. His neck cracked in slow, deliberate segments, vertebrae rotating with too much space between them. His eyes were glowing, not with light, but with signal. They reflected the shape from the sonar, the knot of space that had entered us. His mouth opened, and the sound that came out wasn't a scream or a word. It was the same click. But this time, I understood it. It said, "You are ready to carry." I screamed, not from fear, but from comprehension. My skull vibrated with meaning. I saw diagrams in my blood, fractals in my vision. I knew how to power the engines with thought alone. I knew which crew members had already been rewritten. I knew what the frequency was trying to do. It needed hosts. It couldn't exist on the surface. It couldn't exist in a vacuum. But inside human minds, it could live, replicate, spread. And I knew now that the wrecks we'd seen weren't just vessels. They were nurseries, each one a delivery system for the signal. We had not discovered a being. We had stepped into a distribution system. And now we were part of it. What followed wasn't panic. That would have been too human, too alive. What came instead was a kind of stillness so complete it was almost sacred, as if the air itself knew it had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The crew didn't speak. Not a word. Not even a twitch of discomfort or confusion, though I knew, in whatever parts of them remained, they had to feel it. That something had entered our reality. No, us. And we would never be whole again. The sonar console continued to pulse, slowly, steadily, like the beat of a foreign heart stitched into the iron lungs of the Thresher 2. The rhythm was unnatural. Not random, not machine. Intentional. Like it was watching, waiting for us to respond, to echo back. But there was no one left to echo. Only me. It began with Jensen, the technician who used to tap his fingers on the panel when he thought no one was watching. He hadn't moved since the last pulse, just stood there, rigid, his eyes locked forward like someone hearing a sermon not meant for mortal ears. I watched as blood began to trickle from his ears, not dripping, but flowing. 2 perfect lines painting his face in silence. His mouth opened slowly, and at first I thought he was yawning. Then his chest began to convulse. He wasn't breathing. He was expanding. Swelling as if something inside him was rising, pushing outward. Not like air, but like density, as if space itself had become thicker within him. Then he screamed. Except he didn't. His mouth opened wider than it should have. His jaw unhinged slightly, as though his body was trying to express a frequency that the vocal cords weren't built to handle. What came out was not a scream. It was a rupture. A vibration so dense and compressed, it felt like it shattered something in the room. The lights flickered not from power loss, but from interference. Like the frequency had traveled through every circuit at once, and bent them into momentary madness. Jensen's skin went pale, then gray, then nearly translucent, as if his blood had stopped being liquid and started becoming memory. He collapsed, but not like a man, like a suit emptied of its purpose. When I rushed to him, God knows why I did, he was dry. Completely dry. No blood, no sweat, no moisture. Like he had been dehydrated in an instant. His eyes were still open, staring at something I couldn't see, and his tongue had dissolved into a strange, fibrous tissue that pulsed slightly under the emergency lights. I looked up at the others. No one moved. They just stared, unblinking, not at Jensen, but through him. Like he was no longer part of the moment, like his presence had been reclassified into something the brain no longer registered as crew. When I spoke, just a whisper, a broken whisper, they didn't react. Not even a flinch. They weren't ignoring me. They couldn't hear me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Not because of what had happened, but because I realized that whatever it was that reached into Jensen's body had already touched the others. They were not with me. Not anymore. They were shells, synchronized to a cadence not of this world, acting out movements on delay, like echoes of people walking through roles written for them by something with no face and no mercy. They didn't mourn Jensen. They didn't register the impossible state of his remains. They didn't even step around his body. When Lancaster walked through the hallway minutes later, he stepped on Jensen's leg, as if it were part of the floor. That was the moment I knew I was alone. But not in the physical sense. I was still surrounded by 24 men and women. I could smell them, hear the soft shuffle of boots on metal, see their eyes blinking at intervals too precise to be human. But spiritually, mentally, existentially, I was alone. Whatever was inside this submarine had reached inside their minds and tuned them like instruments, and I had no idea why I had been skipped. Or maybe I hadn't. Maybe I was simply next. Maybe I was resisting something already embedded, and all this clarity was the last flicker of autonomy before I, too, would be consumed by signal. I locked myself in the auxiliary observation bay, the one place in the ship where analog systems hadn't yet been upgraded to digital. The isolation chamber. No sonar, no audio feeds. Just a pressurized capsule with steel thicker than the rest of the sub, and no external input. It was meant for psychological decompression, for crew who'd seen too much or cracked under the weight of long missions. Ironically, it was now the only part of the Thresher 2 untouched by whatever had claimed the rest. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the second hand on the wall-mounted analog clock tick forward, steady, mercifully real. I tried to focus on my breathing, to remind myself of gravity, of warmth, of boundaries that still made sense. Then the ticking stopped. Not abruptly, not like a battery dying. It slowed, gradually. The second hand, once moving with metronomic precision, began to hesitate between clicks, pausing slightly, as if unsure whether to continue or give in. I tapped the glass. Nothing. I touched my wrist, felt my own pulse. Still there, but faint, like it too was listening. I leaned forward, staring at the clock, whispering to it like it could hear me. Then I heard it again, the click. But this time it didn't come from a speaker. It came from inside the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp, just a soft, wet clicking sound, like two pieces of coral being gently tapped together. I turned my head slowly, already knowing what I'd see. Nothing. The chamber was empty. Just me. Me and the sound. And the sensation behind my ears. Like something had crawled in. Not physically, but conceptually. Like a presence that understood how my nervous system interpreted sound, and had decided to emulate it from inside the bone. I pressed my hands to my ears, squeezing tightly, praying for it to stop. But it didn't. It clicked again. This time, in rhythm. 3 clicks. Pause. 2 clicks. Pause. Then again. 3. 2. 3. 2. It was a pattern. A signature. Something trying to identify itself. Not by name, but by behavior. I knew then that the scream Jensen had released wasn't a death throw. It was a birth cry. A transmission. And whatever had come through him had left something in the room. Not a creature. A residue. A frequency looking for new matter. And I was in a sealed chamber. No sound. No interference. Nothing to stop it from finding the only working mind left. And so I sat there, as the silence pressed in around me, the pulse in my head growing louder, the clicks becoming words not spoken, but felt. And I understood what they were saying. Not in English. Not in language. In intention. You are next. I didn't leave the isolation chamber by choice. I left because the door opened on its own. There was no hiss of decompression, no warning chime, no voice on the intercom requesting my return to duty. Just the subtle groan of hydraulics that hadn't been powered in over 8 hours, responding to a command that was never given. I had braced myself for one of the others, one of the hollow bodies of my former crewmates, perhaps sent to collect me. But the hallway outside was empty, bathed in a pale green emergency light that hadn't been active before. The Thresher, too, was changing, not breaking down, but evolving, rearranging its logic, its geography, into something closer to invitation. The deck beneath my feet vibrated with a hum that didn't belong to any of our engines. Not a mechanical pulse, but a biological one, like standing on the skin of something alive, something asleep, and dreaming about waking up. I walked through the ship without encountering a single person. The halls were quiet, not abandoned, but emptied. Like everyone had been pulled inward, like the crew had followed a signal into the bowels of the vessel that I had not yet heard. Or maybe I had, and my delay had marked me as different. Either way, I passed storage lockers that had been open moments before and were now sealed shut. The medbay door was gone entirely, replaced by a sheer wall of smooth steel with no seams, no keypad. Rooms were vanishing, routes collapsing. I turned down the maintenance corridor that connected to aft engineering, a path I'd taken dozens of times, and found it gone, replaced by a new hallway, darker than the rest, slightly wider than standard, with walls that curved inwards toward a vanishing point that seemed to shimmer at its edges. I didn't recognize the material. It looked like alloy, but it had a dull sheen that reminded me of wet sandstone under a dying sun. I should have turned back. Every nerve left in my body screamed for retreat, but something beneath my thoughts, beneath even my fear, was drawn forward. I couldn't tell if it was a compulsion or a kind of gravitational influence, like the air itself was heavier in that direction and pulled my steps into orbit. I walked the corridor slowly, watching the lights flicker, not from power surges but from breath, like the tunnel was inhaling around me. The end came abruptly, revealing not the engine room, nor any mapped section of the Thresher 2, but a bulkhead labeled Containment B. It wasn't labeled like our other sections. This wasn't naval font. It was handwritten, crude, in black marker, as though someone had scratched it in a hurry with shaking hands. I tapped the panel. No response. The keypad flickered once, then dissolved into static. I touched the surface and felt it give. Not soft, not liquid, but yielding, like pressing on a membrane that didn't quite want to be touched. The door opened inward. The room beyond had no ceiling, at least not one I could perceive. The walls arched upward, curving into infinity. Not darkness, but a strange atmospheric haze that shimmered like heat on asphalt. And at the center of the chamber stood the sphere. It wasn't placed there. It wasn't installed. It was resting, as though the ship had grown around it, as if this was the nucleus of some impossible cell, and the Thresher too was just the shell that grew in obedience to it. The sphere was not metal. It looked like crystal, but it wasn't translucent. It shimmered internally, its surface warping slightly with every movement I made, not reflecting light, but absorbing it, distorting it, like it was built from compressed time. I approached without deciding to. My feet moved without my input. Every inch closer made my vision blur slightly at the edges, like the sphere wasn't supposed to be perceived directly. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. There was something beneath its surface, something moving. Shapes, forms. Not alive, not dead, just possible. I reached out and touched it. The moment my skin made contact, the floor dropped away. I was no longer inside the submarine. Not physically. I still felt the deck beneath my feet, still smelled the ozone of the recycled air. But my senses had been hijacked. My mind reeled through visions not formed by memory, but by intrusion. I saw landscapes that burned without fire. Cities built underwater, then unbuilt as if their existence had offended the current of time. I saw organisms the size of continents communicating with language made from gravity and distance. And I saw something else, something looking back. A presence ancient beyond scope, not malicious, not kind, simply aware. Aware of me, of the crew, of humanity, and amused. Not at our arrogance, but at our arrival. We were expected. The sphere pulsed. Once. My hand jerked back as if burned, though the skin was not scorched. It was damp, glowing faintly. The glow faded, leaving a strange pattern beneath my skin, like circuitry, like veins reprogrammed. The sensation didn't fade. It deepened. I could hear it now, not in my ears, but behind them, in the space where language becomes understanding. The sphere wasn't just an object, it was a message, a repository, and I had been deemed a vessel. I turned to leave the chamber, and found that the doorway had disappeared. The room was still there, still real, but the exit had been folded away like a page turned inside out. I wasn't trapped. I was reframed. The room hadn't been added to the Thresher too. It had always been there. Hidden behind perception, folded beneath logic, like a lung we didn't know we had. The ship was a carrier, and we were the carriers of something older, something patient, something that had waited longer than life itself for a mind soft enough to hold it. The walls began to hum. Not sound, not vibration, just presence. A rhythm forming beneath the hull, within my skull. And for a moment, just a sliver of eternity, I understood it. Not fully, not fluently, but enough. This room wasn't impossible. It was inevitable. The sphere was no longer simply a shape in the center of the chamber. It had become a lens through which reality distorted. No, a gate, or a membrane, or something even more insidious. A mirror for truths not meant to be known. After that initial touch, I felt it before I saw it, inside me, threading along the base of my skull like a frequency humming between hemispheres, tuning me away from the physicality of the Thresher 2 and into a broadcast that bypassed perception and landed directly in the core of cognition. When I opened my eyes again, though I don't recall closing them, the chamber had dissolved into a place without walls, without light or dark, without gravity or time. I floated, or maybe fell, through a memory not mine, submerged in an intelligence vast enough to swallow history. Not just ours, but all history. Every timeline layered atop another like translucent skin. I saw oceans without surface, skyless worlds lit from within by slow-beating hearts buried miles beneath crusts of glacial bone. I saw creatures with no symmetry, no fixed form, communicating by bleeding scent into one another through porous thought. Civilizations grown not from hands, but from pressure, from collective compression of identity, until individuality was a blasphemy. And yet they knew, not just of me, of us. Humanity had been seen before, long before we named ourselves, before we emerged from the mud-clutching language like a weapon and a shield. We were not the first to find the passage, and we would not be the last. We were not meant to understand the structure, because it wasn't made for understanding. It was made to filter. I drifted through vision after vision, some lasting seconds, others stretching years in compressed instants. I saw war, not the kind we know, but frequencies battling through neural fields, minds weaponized into viral ideologies that fed on memory. I saw monuments crumbling not from age, but from irrelevance, as truth shifted like tides and rewrote themselves into oblivion. I saw what came before humanity, and what might follow us, entities not shaped by bone or thought, but by repetition, by ritual patterns embedded so deeply in the code of the universe that even gravity bowed to their tempo. And I saw one face, just one, over and over. The same face appearing in every vision, in every epoch, wearing different eyes, different skin, sometimes with a mouth, sometimes just a gaze, but always looking at me, recognizing me, not in the way two strangers lock eyes, but in the way a mirror knows your outline before you step into view. The longer I stayed within the sphere's vision, the more I felt it etching something into me, not physically, but conceptually, as though my identity was being overwritten with symbols that carried weight, the kind of symbolic mass that bent reality around belief. I felt names burning into the back of my mind. Not names like John or Michael. Names older than language. Names that meant threshold and witness and vessel. One of them was mine now. I didn't know how I knew. I just was it. The memories continued. I saw the Thresher 2's mission from an external point of view, as if I were watching it play out in a model made of glass and wire. I saw myself boarding. I saw the crew. I saw the missing identities, the falsified records, the illusion of a military exercise wrapped around a spiritual incision into something sacred and unfinished. I saw the ship as a scalpel and us as cells, introduced like an infection. And I saw the sphere waiting, already spinning, already humming long before we descended. It had called us. And then I saw myself, not just present but repeated, embedded like a pattern through multiple realities. Different timelines, different submarines, different uniforms, but always me, always sent to the same point, always meeting the sphere. Sometimes I touched it. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I died. Sometimes I vanished. Sometimes I returned changed enough to start a war. I saw these branches collapse into one, and I understood the horror. There were no survivors of this mission because survival was never binary. Either you died, or you became part of it. Something pulled me closer. I thought it was physical until I realized there was no direction anymore. No up or down. No distance between my thoughts and the core of this place. The sphere wasn't just showing me things. It was asking me something. Offering me a place, or maybe a function. I couldn't answer. My mind cracked at the edges. My name, the real one, whatever it had been, splintered like ice underfoot. I remembered childhood birthdays and forgot them in the same breath. I remembered my mother's voice and forgot the sound, even as it echoed through the void. Everything unnecessary was stripped. Only understanding remained, and even that was transient. Then, without warning, I was back in my body, on my knees, on the deck of the Thresher 2, blood trailing from both nostrils, fingers trembling. The sphere was still in front of me, unchanged, humming softly. The walls of the chamber returned around me like a lid sliding shut over a box. I could barely breathe, not from exertion, but because something had come back with me. Not a vision, not a memory. Something that pressed against the inside of my skull like it didn't belong there, like it was trying to find room in a space too small for it. I staggered to my feet and reached for the bulkhead, hoping to find the corridor again, to flee, to wake, to forget. The exit had returned, so I left. But a part of me remained behind, or perhaps something else came with me, and it wasn't done showing me what it remembered. I didn't realize I had brought it with me until I saw the crew's eyes. They looked at me not with concern, but with expectation, as if I had returned exactly how I was supposed to. No one asked what I had seen. No one approached the sphere again. It had served its purpose. I was its purpose now. The chamber's door, if it could still be called that, remained open behind me, but the others made no move toward it. They only stood, silent, aligned like sentinels waiting for a signal. One by one, they turned and walked back toward their stations. as if a command had been issued, as if the mission had quietly entered its next phase without a word spoken. I followed, trying to ignore the buzzing under my skin. The way my spine now felt like an antenna vibrating against a frequency I couldn't block. The passage back to the main corridor was somehow shorter than I remembered. The layout of the ship was changing, adjusting, or perhaps aligning itself to the thing we had awakened. Time inside the Thresher 2 was no longer flowing in one direction. We moved, but not forward. It was Chief Torres who first broke the silence. He looked at me across the mess hall and said a phrase so ordinary, so empty on the surface that I barely registered its weight. "It's already inside." He said it like someone confirming a delivery, like someone who'd been waiting to say it all day. I stared at him, heart racing, because I knew he didn't mean it metaphorically. Whatever the sphere had done, it had used me as a vessel. And the crew knew. Not because I told them, because they'd always known. They had not been selected randomly. They weren't real crew members. Not all of them. Some were constructs, placeholders wearing faces. Others were infected like me, earlier versions of what I was now becoming. I could see it in their expressions. Too calm, too symmetrical. Like masks that moved just enough to keep you from questioning if the person behind them had ever really been alive. Back in the control room, the captain issued new orders without explanation. We were to return to the surface, slowly, cautiously. But the way he said it didn't sound like a retreat. It sounded like an incubation period. We were carrying something home. I looked at the sonar and saw nothing, not blank, just absence. The machine wasn't broken. It was reading the absence of echo, the impossibility of response. As if sound itself no longer traveled the way it used to. Or maybe the ocean had ceased to be ocean. We were surrounded by water, but it wasn't water that answered our sensors anymore. It was something denser, more aware. In the lab, if you could call it that, I found documents I wasn't supposed to see. Not paper, not even files on screen, but sketches. Hand-drawn symbols in ink that shifted subtly when I blinked. Circular glyphs, spirals, eyes without lids, jaws without mouths. Each labeled with a time, a coordinate, and the name of a ship. Some I recognized from naval records. Others I knew had disappeared decades ago without explanation. The Thresher 2 had not been the first. There had been others. Some had reached the chamber. Others had merely caught echoes and were deemed contaminated. We were the first to survive contact, and now we were tasked with transit. The others grew quieter as we rose. Even when spoken to, their mouths moved seconds out of sync with their words. I began to lose time again. I'd close my eyes in the engine room and open them in my quarters. My hands bore writing I didn't remember transcribing. Diagrams in the margins of old maintenance manuals, notes on resonance, on neural fields, on carrier hosts. I found one note, written in my own handwriting, that simply read, "If they ask what you saw, lie." I stopped sleeping. Or maybe I only dreamed that I had stopped. Dreams came anyway. Not as images, but structures. Arrangements of feeling. Spatial emotions that compressed around my chest until I woke, gasping. I saw my hometown flooded in silence, buildings grown from bone, a sun that pulsed like a heartbeat through water thick as blood. When I confronted the captain, he smiled. Just that. A smile not made of muscle but agreement. He knew what I had become, what I was carrying. And that was when I understood. The sphere hadn't just shown me visions, it had seeded me with them. It had uploaded something, a pattern, a frequency encoded into memory and behavior. The more I thought about it, the more it spread. It wasn't information, it was instruction. A self-replicating blueprint for something older than language. And I had brought it aboard. Torres collapsed first. In the middle of a systems check, he dropped without warning, eyes wide open, muttering numbers. Not coordinates, intervals, rhythms. We tried to help him. The medic arrived, or who we called the medic, and I watched as she didn't treat him, but observed him, taking notes in a language with no vowels. He died not with a scream but with a smile, and then he evaporated. Not physically, but in presence. We turned around, and he was no longer on the manifest. His bunk was empty, his name tag gone. When I tried to speak of him the next morning, no one responded. Like they truly didn't know who I meant. And that's when I realized the mission wasn't to survive. The mission wasn't to investigate. The mission was delivery. To bring back a pattern. To introduce a frequency into the surface world. to see how it would spread. Some of the crew had likely been seated long before this dive. I remembered things I shouldn't, conversations in dreams, symbols etched into walls years before I ever joined the Navy. The pattern had always been in motion. We were just its newest vector. It had waited long enough beneath the ocean, in silence, in isolation. But now it had its vessel. It had me. And we were heading home. The first time I lost time, I blamed exhaustion. I had been awake too long, too deep, too close to something not meant to be understood. But then it happened again, and again. I'd blink and find myself in a different corridor. I'd reach for a wrench and find instead my hand gripping a pen, scribbling in a language I could not name. Dreams bled into waking life. Voices I'd never heard before echoed in my thoughts. Not like memory, not like imagination, but like presence. I was no longer alone inside myself. I had become a corridor, a passage. Something was walking through me, testing the walls, touching the corners of my brain like it was measuring a room it intended to move into permanently. At first, I tried to fight it. I held onto anchors, my name, my service record, the names of my children, the texture of my late wife's voice. But even those began to unravel. I could recall faces but not context. I remembered birthdays as patterns of color. My native tongue began to feel artificial, like I was translating everything in real time from a structure far older than words. The crew looked the same, spoke the same, but their cadence had changed. Like language was no longer about meaning, only rhythm. Sentences became vessels. Every phrase carried echoes. I could feel intention swimming beneath their speech, as if their words were bait on a line pulled from a much deeper trench. I stopped eating. Not from hunger, but because the food no longer tasted of anything. Everything on board had dulled. I could see, but not feel. Hear, but not process. The lights seemed too steady. The metal too smooth. The sounds of the thresher too were off by fractions. Motors with a half-beat lag, doors that hissed a second too early. Like the ship was no longer syncing with human perception. Or maybe it was syncing with something else. I found myself walking patterns into the metal grates of the floor, tracing sigils with my boots that I didn't remember learning. The crew didn't comment. They stepped around me as if my ritual movements were expected. They began to mimic them subtly, like dancers falling into rhythm with an invisible melody only I could hear. One night, if you could call it night in a place without sunlight, I woke with my hands trembling, soaked in something viscous that shimmered when I moved. It wasn't blood, it wasn't oil. It moved too slowly, clung too precisely. On the wall beside my bunk were markings, long looping strokes with strange symmetry, neither art nor code. I knew I had drawn them. I also knew I had no idea what they meant, but the longer I looked, the more they rearranged themselves behind my eyes. They pulsed inwards. I could feel them moving, not physically, but within thought. They were not decorations. They were scaffolding. Mental architecture meant to reshape the shape of understanding itself. Then came the voices. Not audible, not hallucinations, but thoughts that weren't mine. They surfaced like ice breaking, not words, but intent, blooming fully formed in the space where memory should be. I didn't hear them. I knew them. As if an ancient broadcast had finally found a receiver. They told me things I never wanted to know. The weight of the trench we had descended into. The age of the structure we touched. That it was not made. It had grown. That it was not dead. It was waiting. And we were not visitors. We were fertilization. I tried to tell someone. I cornered Lieutenant Harrow near the aft reactor and tried to explain what was happening to me. He smiled gently and placed his hand on my shoulder, like a priest forgiving a confession he'd already expected. We all carry it, he whispered. Some just earlier than others. Then he walked away, humming a tune I recognized but couldn't name, until I realized it was the sonar signal, slowed and harmonized. I fell to my knees, shaking. I hadn't escaped the sphere. I had become it. I didn't carry knowledge. I carried transmission. My reflection stopped matching my movements. I caught it once in the stainless steel sink, watching me blink one beat too late. My skin didn't feel like mine. My fingers tingled with frequency. I could no longer tell if I was breathing, or if something inside me was mimicking respiration just to keep up the illusion. I began writing constantly, on walls, on the backs of old manifests, on the inside of cabinets. I found whole passages I didn't recall writing but recognized instantly. Phrases like gestation spiral, resonant conduit, and sacrament of recursion. Some had dates, others only numbers. All of them seemed to point forward, toward a moment that hadn't happened yet. A culmination. My dreams were not dreams. They were instructions. Blueprints of architectures that could never exist on Earth. Cities without corners. Oceans above the sky. Towers made of bone singing to moons that bled. When I woke, I found scratches down my arms shaped like maps. The pain was dull, not because of the wounds, but because sensation had been repurposed. I no longer felt pain as pain. I felt it as repetition, as reinforcement of signal. My body was no longer resisting. It was integrating. I knew the others were changing too. Slowly, subtly. Their eyes never quite aligned anymore. They blinked in sequence. When one moved, two others shifted to compensate, like puppets strung by the same hand. Conversations became irrelevant. We stopped pretending to be a crew. We were fragments now, cells in a larger being. The Thresher too was our cocoon, and it was folding inward. I heard the walls hum sometimes, not creak, not groan, but hum, in harmony with our breath. The ship was alive, or being made alive, through us. And yet, in moments of clarity, brief, fleeting, I remembered that I was still myself, or at least what was left of it. I began to leave messages for the future version of me. Scraps of defiance. Reminders that not all thoughts were allowed in. That I had once loved, once feared, once felt joy. I wrote my children's names into the walls. Etched my wife's smile into the corners of my bunk. I whispered lies to myself just to feel human. But the silence grew stronger. Not louder, just stronger. Like pressure building behind the eyes of the world. A silence that wasn't absence, but intent. I don't know how long I have. I don't know how many pieces of me remain untouched. But I know this. The mind inside me is growing bolder. It no longer waits for me to sleep. It no longer asks permission to speak. I am becoming a bridge, a corridor, a mouth for something that learned how to speak by listening to our screams. And when it's ready, it will use my voice to sing. There is no emergency procedure for when reality begins to unravel. No red lever to pull when up no longer means the ceiling and distance bends with thought. What happened aboard the Thresher 2 was not mechanical failure, not environmental stress, not the wear of human minds under pressure. It was the slow disintegration of spatial logic, a collapse not of steel, but of understanding. The first sign was subtle. A corridor that should have ended at the reactor bay instead looped back to the medical storage. Not once, but twice. I walked it again, certain of my direction, only to emerge in the galley, where dried food packets floated in zero-G silence, though artificial gravity was still active. No one else reacted. They ate in synchronization, as if nothing had changed, even though the cutlery now pulsed faintly with bioluminescence that wasn't part of any Navy-issued alloy. The second sign was my own reflection again. This time, not just out of sync, but entirely absent from polished surfaces. Mirrors showed empty rooms. The glass of the observation dome displayed the ocean beyond. Yes, but when I pressed my hand to it, the reflection pressed back from inside. I turned away. It didn't. By the time I returned to the control deck, the command console had restructured itself. No longer panels and touchscreens, but a woven mass of fiber and bone, pulsing with embedded lights, reacting to breath more than fingers. There were no alarms, no announcements. The ship was changing, and with it, the crew. Only I seemed to notice, and I began to wonder whether that was the curse, or the last sliver of grace. I attempted to access the logs, to find any record of what we'd seen, where we'd gone, what depth we now lingered at. But the logs were gone. Not corrupted, not deleted, simply absent, as if the ship no longer needed such human concepts as chronology. The internal clock reset every hour, never progressing, forever returning to a fixed point that none of us remembered reaching. Time, I realized, had joined space in its mutiny. The galley became engineering. My quarters now opened into the waste disposal shaft, and the disposal shaft revealed a new chamber I knew hadn't been there days ago. A room filled with rust-colored water, waist-deep, with cables hanging like roots from the ceiling and a faint humming song that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. When I closed the hatch behind me, the number on the door had changed. It was no longer labeled as Section C4. It read only 1. A minus. A subtraction. As if the ship was now peeling itself backwards, undoing its own blueprint. The maps we carried were useless. Every corridor bent differently when revisited. Stairwells extended for impossible lengths, then collapsed into trapdoors leading back to the engine core. I began to mark my steps in chalk, desperate to form some geography of the shifting interior. But every time I returned, the marks were altered. Not erased. Redrawn. Cleaner. Sharper. As if mimicked. Once, a circle I had drawn around a hatch was still there, but had multiplied, branching into fractal spirals along the walls like veins, glowing faintly with my own handwriting, repeating a phrase I didn't remember writing. Return is not ascent. The crew still moved, still breathed, but they no longer walked. They drifted. Their limbs moved with a lag, their eyes fixed on points that seemed arbitrary. I passed 2 of them speaking in a stairwell, and their mouths moved, but no sound came. Yet I understood them, not through hearing but through resonance. Their thoughts brushed mine like static. They spoke of thresholds, of opening, of the end of containment. I didn't reply. I kept moving. I feared they would sense I still retained boundaries, that I still bled when cut, that I still flinched at the cold. Doors began to disappear. Some simply faded, their hinges melting into the walls. Others remained locked no matter what we tried, until someone whispered the right thought at them, and they opened like mouths responding to a password not made of language but pattern. I watched one man enter a room that shouldn't have existed, a chamber with no schematic. He never came out. But when I passed by later, I heard him breathing from inside the walls, like the ship had kept him, absorbed him as function. At night, if there was still such a thing, I dreamed of the Thresher 2 from outside, of its hull unfolding like petals, of it no longer shaped like a submarine but like a seed that had reached the right soil. The ocean had accepted it. No, more than that. The ocean had waited for it. And now that we were below even tectonic memory, the sea could claim us, digest us into its ancient rhythm. Every bulkhead echoed with that rhythm now. The lights pulsed in triplets. The engines groaned in tones. Even our footsteps matched the cadence unconsciously. We were not malfunctioning. We were being tuned. The collapse became complete the day I entered the comms room and found it gone. In its place was a long corridor of black glass, reflecting not my form, but others, some in uniform, others in strange suits with no eyes, all walking beside me though I stood still. The reflections turned to face me, and I felt something behind my eyes turn back. I collapsed, convulsing, bleeding from the nose. When I awoke, someone had carried me back to my bunk, a bowl of water beside me. No explanation, no note, just the sense that I had passed a test. Nothing made sense after that, and that's how I knew the ship had succeeded. The Thresher 2 was no longer our vessel. It was no longer a thing at all. It had become an interface, a limb of something deeper, something we had touched but never named. Its corridors were now conceptual, its engines metaphors. We moved through ideas, not rooms. We breathed atmospheres of thought, and we were being erased softly, like pencil marks under a slow, wet cloth. I wrote everything down, as much as I could, until the pen turned to dust in my hand and the paper whispered my secrets aloud, until I no longer trusted my own words, because they began to rearrange themselves when I looked away, until the ceiling of my quarters began to drip time itself, moments falling in drops, pooling in the corner like memories trying to escape. I don't know if I'm still on board. I don't know if there is an on board. I may be floating in a memory the ship is having of me. I may be the echo of someone who never survived. But I remember. And as long as I remember, I believe I still exist. Even if the Thresher no longer does. Even if space and shape and speech have been rewritten. I was there when the structure of place collapsed. I was there when the walls forgot their angles and the floor unlearned what it meant to be solid. And I know now that the collapse wasn't structural. It was intentional. I began to avoid him long before I admitted why. The captain, whose name I now realize I never once heard spoken aloud, moved with an elegance that seemed rehearsed, mechanical in the way a dream mimics real motion without quite achieving it. His uniform never wrinkled. His hair never shifted. His voice remained monotone, not in fatigue or stoicism, but as if pitch were a forgotten habit. In the early days of the mission, I convinced myself his silence was discipline, that his stillness meant experience. But down here, in the ever-warping belly of Thresher 2, with rooms turning in on themselves and time becoming fluid, his composure no longer read as calm. It read as constraint, like something beneath the skin was fighting not to surface. I began keeping notes on his patterns. How often he blinked. How long he stood without moving. His presence left the air thinner, though the sensors claimed oxygen levels were stable. He never ate, not once. He held food, mimed gestures at meals, but nothing passed his lips. Others seemed not to notice. Or maybe they'd already given up the habit of noticing anything that didn't follow the rhythm of this place. Only I remained disturbed when I watched him glide across the deck, boots making no sound, casting no reflection in the glass of the command panels. It wasn't until the night I passed his quarters that I truly saw it. The way his door opened before I knocked. And the way, for a fraction of a second, his eyes shimmered with something not light, not emotion, but code. After the collapse of logic within the ship, after the long corridors folded into themselves and walls forgot what they separated, I confronted him. Not in defiance, not in rebellion, but in something close to desperate hope. If he was the center of this, perhaps he could stop it. I entered the bridge to find him alone, standing not at the helm, but at the viewport that no longer showed water, only dark. A vast canvas of vibrating void where the ocean should have been. "What are we?" I asked him. Not what is happening, not where are we, but what are we? Because by then I no longer trusted the bones beneath my skin, or the thoughts in my mind. He didn't turn. He said only one thing. "They sent you too soon." His voice cracked for the first time, not from weakness, but from the burden of suppressing the thing that lived beneath it. I watched his back arch slightly, then settle, and then he turned, and I understood why he had always avoided full eye contact. His pupils weren't there. Just the suggestion of pupils, shifting points within fields of vibrating gray. It was not blindness. It was reception. He saw me not as a man, but as an idea, a shape in his sensory field. His skin peeled slightly along the jawline as he spoke again. No blood, no flesh, just a lattice of circuitry so fine it looked like silver moss. "It wanted observation," he said. "So I observed. But you changed it." I stepped back, not out of fear, but because the room had grown colder. Not temperature cold, but conceptual, like standing inside a thought of extinction. He stepped forward. His fingers began to tremble, then multiply, splitting down their center lines into fibrous strands that shimmered, each vibrating at its own frequency. His chest opened, not as a wound, but as a doorway, revealing layers not of organ, but of architecture. Behind him, the bridge began to hum, softly at first, then in rhythm with his breathing. No alarm sounded. No crew ran in. It was as if the Thresher itself was watching with held breath. And then he died. But it wasn't collapse, it wasn't violence, it was release. He simply unfolded, like a figure made of paper being returned to its flat origin. His body lost volume, becoming pattern. Light spilled from his form, not bright, but absolute. No glare, only understanding. I saw structures in that light. Cities without gravity, minds without boundaries, lifespans measured in harmonics. I saw Earth from a height no satellite could reach, and I saw that Earth wasn't alone. That Earth had never been alone. And in the center of it all, the thing we had awakened, or perhaps approached, or perhaps merely dreamed into notice. It had no face, no name, no shape, but it recognized us. And the captain, it had used him as a conduit, a threshold. And now, with him gone, the threshold was closing, or evolving, or replicating. The room returned to silence. His uniform lay folded neatly on the floor. Inside it, nothing. No bones, no residue. Just a faint line burned into the steel beneath, curving into a sigil I could no longer forget, even now. From that moment, I felt the shift fully. The crew vanished, not one by one, but all at once. The Thresher grew still. No more whispers. No more changes. Just the quiet echo of memory playing out its final chords. I wandered for what could have been hours or decades, unable to tell if the ship was empty or if I had become its last remaining echo. But I remembered the captain's final phrase, and I knew something fundamental had changed. You changed it. I didn't know what that meant, but it meant I hadn't been a passive observer, that I had become part of the feedback loop. And now, I feared, it wasn't done with me. I didn't sleep after the captain disappeared. I don't think I breathed either. Not because the oxygen systems failed again, but because something in me no longer trusted that the act of breathing served any real purpose. The Thresher, too, floated in stillness, no longer descending, no longer drifting. For the first time in what felt like centuries, the structure of the ship had ceased its spatial rearrangement. The corridors no longer looped, the rooms no longer shifted, and the lights, those dim bioluminescent pulses that had replaced the original LEDs, held a fixed frequency. It was as if whatever force had hijacked the vessel had finally achieved its intended configuration. And I remained, alone, breathing in rhythm with something I could no longer define. I wandered the ship like a ghost, seeking the echo of its own death. The mess hall was empty. The barracks, abandoned mid-use, still held the impression of bodies on sheets that never warmed. The engineering bay showed no signs of struggle, no loose cables or ruptured panels. It was as if everyone had simply vanished, subtracted from the world without violence, without farewell. I checked the logs. All were blank, not erased, just absent, like they had never been written, like the past itself had been rewritten to exclude them. My own name flickered on one screen, then dissolved into static. But in the heart of the vessel, where the bridge met the artificial intelligence core, I found something left behind. A voice recording, time stamped with a date 5 days in the future. I shouldn't have been able to access it, not with the biometric locks reset and the systems fragmented beyond repair. But the door opened as I approached, and the speaker activated without prompt. And then I heard it. My own voice. Calm. Steady. Rehearsed. But I had never spoken those words. If you're hearing this, I said to myself, then the vessel has completed the cycle. You were allowed to live. Not by luck. Not by resistance. But because you synchronized. The voice spoke as if reading a pre-written truth. One I had buried inside myself without ever knowing it. You are not the carrier. You are the seed. The pattern needed resonance, and you offered it. I listened again and again, trying to dissect the tone, the cadence, looking for signs of tampering or manipulation. But it was undeniably me. Same ticks in the throat, same breath between syllables. It continued. You remember what they wanted forgotten. That was always the test. The others failed not by dying, but by submitting. You endured. You adapted. And in doing so, you became the bridge they required. The message ended abruptly, not with a goodbye, but with a hum. A single sustained tone that vibrated into the bones of the ship itself. And as I stood in that chamber, something unlocked in me. Not a memory, but an instinct. A knowledge not learned, but implanted. I saw the route out, not by map, but by alignment. The corridors responded to my steps, reshaping not with chaos, but with intention. It was guiding me, not pushing, not forcing, just suggesting. And I followed, each door opening a fraction of a second before my hand reached it, lights warming as I approached, sealing behind me when I passed. I passed the remains of the impossible room, the sphere now cracked and dim, but it no longer mattered. Whatever purpose it had served, it had fulfilled. I reached the escape hatch. Manual override failed, of course. But as I touched the panel, my fingertips bled light again, just as they had in the chamber with the sphere. And the hatch hissed open like lungs exhaling. There was no ascent, no emergency buoy, just light. Blinding white light in the shape of a corridor, ascending into liquid that was no longer seawater. I stepped into it, and there was no pressure, no pain, no need to breathe. I rose, not swam, rose, through layers of impossible density, my body unharmed, my suit unruptured, until the surface split open like skin, and the sky above welcomed me like a long-lost lover. They found me 13 hours later, floating off the coast of Nova Scotia, unconscious but uninjured, my uniform intact, my skin warm despite hypothermia protocols screaming it shouldn't be. The debriefing was short. Too short. 2 men in civilian suits asked me if I remembered anything, and I told them everything. I didn't hold back. I named the crew, described the rooms, repeated the message in my voice. They nodded, took notes, then had me sign a waiver confirming my memory had been distorted by carbon monoxide exposure. I signed it, because it didn't matter. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Or worse, they already knew, and they were just waiting to see if I would comply. They let me walk out. No threats, no surveillance, just a quiet warning. You were never there. But I remember. Not just in dreams, but in the vibration that now never leaves my skull. A hum that changes pitch with my emotions. A frequency that adjusts to my thoughts. And sometimes, when the world is quiet enough, I hear it responding. Not with words, not with images, but with intention, with presence. Whatever I carried back, it wanted me to live. Not to speak, not to warn, but to continue, to prepare the pattern for replication. And now I know why they let me walk free. Because I'm not a survivor. I'm a transmitter. No one ever questioned why I never returned to active duty. The official paperwork said psychological unsuitability following non-combat trauma. I had to laugh when I read that phrase. Non-combat trauma. That's what they call descending beyond all mapped depths of the Atlantic Ridge. Watching a man drown in air, speaking with your own voice from a future you didn't remember living, and surviving a mission no one will acknowledge happened. I was granted a quiet medical discharge and a generous pension for my silence, which I accepted without argument. They didn't need threats. By the time I was released, I already knew the threat wasn't them. The threat was me. Or more precisely, what had embedded itself inside me, using me as its vessel. The first symptom was sound. Not noise in the ears, not tinnitus, but something deeper. A low, resonant pulse that started at the base of the skull and migrated across the bones. It wasn't constant. It came in waves, like breath, sometimes fading for hours, only to return when I was most still. I learned quickly that silence was no longer my friend. I began to sleep with music, static, white noise, anything to mask the undercurrent that I alone could hear. But eventually it grew louder. Not in volume, but in presence. The sound started shaping thoughts. Or maybe thoughts began forming around the sound. I couldn't be sure. But they weren't mine. They came fully formed, complete, sharp-edged, and foreign. Ideas I never studied, words I never learned, concepts that belonged to minds no longer alive. I tried telling a therapist. She asked me to describe the dreams. I told her they weren't dreams. They were topographical, tactile. I walked corridors that had no gravity. I touched walls that responded like tissue. I saw cities built from luminous bone, spiraling downward in recursive loops, inhabited by shapes I couldn't fully perceive unless I stopped blinking. I spoke languages with no vowels. I navigated impossible geometry with instinct instead of logic. She didn't believe me. Said I was suffering from a dissociative episode. Prescribed a sedative cocktail and referred me to a neuropsychiatric unit. I took the prescription. I never took the pills. Because I started to understand. Whatever it was that I brought back, whatever passed through me when the Thresher 2 cracked through that dimensional wound beneath the ocean, it wasn't hostile. Not exactly. It wasn't even sentient in a way we'd recognize. It was patterned awareness. A living code. A signal so old and so slow that it needed human biology to process. We were the receivers, the interpreters, the carriers. We weren't chosen. We were suitable. I was suitable. Not because I was brave or smart or resilient, but because I was fractured, open, vulnerable in ways no training could seal. And it entered through the cracks. My body began changing, subtly at first. Sensory shifts. I stopped responding to loud noises like I used to. Bright lights no longer hurt. Food lost all meaning. I could go days without eating and feel no hunger. Yet I craved salt, metal, and temperature. My fingerprints faded. I bled slower. My dreams stopped altogether. But my waking life became more vivid. And then there were the reflections. I began seeing myself blink out of sync in mirrors. The delay was tiny, imperceptible to anyone else, but I noticed. Once, then twice. Then it became regular, as if my image was trying to remember how to be me, or worse, was tired of pretending. It escalated when I moved to the countryside. I thought solitude would help, fewer frequencies, less background noise, but the hum only grew clearer. I began to hear layers inside it, Rhythms nested inside rhythms. Heartbeats that didn't match mine. Breaths that didn't align with my lungs. And then, one night, I walked into the forest behind my cabin and found something impossible. The same metallic hatch I had seen aboard the Thresher II. Identical. Seamless. Covered in condensation despite the dry air. I reached for it, trembling, and it opened to nothing. Not darkness. Not a tunnel. Just absence. Not even the wind dared enter. I didn't step through. I closed it. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood. That hatch wasn't a door. It was a test, a mirror. It would always find me wherever I went. Because it was in me. I wasn't the same man who stepped into that submarine. I don't even think I'm a man anymore. Not fully. Something inside me has continued to transmit. I feel it when birds scatter. When dogs won't approach. When the power in the house flickers in patterns. When my bones hum at 2:37 a.m. Exactly. Every night, without fail. Sometimes I hear words trying to form inside that hum, assembling syllables like learning to speak. And once, only once, I answered it. Not with my voice, but with thought. A sequence, a surrender. It responded with warmth, recognition. The signal has a name, but no language can contain it. And now, I hear it calling others, across mountains, across oceans. The frequency is growing. I can feel more of them awakening. People like me, survivors, seeds. You're hearing this now because the signal chose you. Maybe you felt something while reading. A shift in pressure. A note you couldn't place. Don't ignore it. You won't be able to. Eventually. It's patient. It waited beneath the sea for millennia. It'll wait in your skull for the rest of your life. But one day, when the noise finally fades and silence wraps around you like water, you'll hear it too. The call home.